You are falling out of the sky on purpose. You have rolled the aeroplane over onto its back, pointed its nose straight down at the earth, and let go. And now you are dropping like a stone, engine howling, the whole world swinging round until there is nothing in the windscreen but the ground rushing up to meet you. And then, over the roar of the engine and the shriek of the air, another sound begins. A wail. A rising, screaming, banshee wail that climbs and climbs as you go faster. A noise built into the aeroplane itself. A siren bolted to the legs of the undercarriage that turns your dive into a scream you can hear for miles. It is meant to be terrifying. And down on the ground, the men and the horses and the families on the road below, they hear it coming before they ever see you, and it freezes the blood in them because they have learned what that sound means. You hold the dive. The needle winds up, the ground fills the glass, and the force of it presses you down into the seat until your arms are lead and the edges of your sight go gray and narrow. You pick your target, a bridge, a gun, a knot of vehicles on a road. You hold it steady in the sight, and at the last possible moment you let the bomb go. And here is the strange part, the part that makes this machine unlike almost anything else in the sky. You do not even have to pull yourself out of the dive. The aeroplane does it for you. A mechanism trips, the controls move on their own, and the machine hauls its own nose up out of the death plunge and back into level flight. And it will do that even if the force of the pull has pushed you clean out of consciousness, even if you have blacked out entirely in your seat. It flies you out of your own dive and hands you back the sky. Now hold that in your mind. A machine so accurate it can plant a bomb on a single bridge from a vertical dive, screaming as it comes so the very sound is a weapon, so clever it can recover itself with an unconscious man at the controls. The most feared aeroplane of the early war. The winged symbol of the Blitzkrieg, the thing that seemed, for 2 terrible years, to be simply unstoppable. And here is what I am going to tell you today, and it is going to sound like heresy. Almost everything you think that terror meant is exactly, precisely backwards. Right. Let me get out from under this thing, wipe the oil off my hands and say hello properly, because this is a machine I have very mixed feelings about, and that is exactly why it is worth an hour of your time. The name's Reg. For the best part of 40 years I made my living keeping old war machines running, a fitter, a mechanic, a restorer, whatever word suits you. Tanks, aircraft, engines by the crate. If it was built to fight and it had seized solid, rotted through, or simply thrown a strop and refused to go, sooner or later it ended up in my shop, dripping on my floor while I muttered at it, not always politely. And of all the machines that ever came through those doors, this one, the Junkers Ju 87, the Stuka, is one of the trickiest to talk about honestly, because the legend is so loud it drowns the truth clean out. The name itself is just a shortening. Stuka comes from a long German word, Sturzkampfflugzeug, which means more or less diving battle aircraft. Dive bomber. That's all it is, a description of the job. But say the word Stuka to almost anybody and they don't hear a job description. They hear that scream. They picture the winged terror of the newsreels, the unstoppable spearhead of the German advance, the aeroplane that made the whole world afraid. And that picture is not exactly wrong, but it is built on a foundation that will not hold the weight people put on it. So what I want to do today is what I always try to do. Take the legend down off the shelf gently, have a proper look at the real machine underneath, and then show you the bit that turns the whole story on its head, because the Stuka is one of the great cautionary tales of the whole war, and almost nobody tells it that way. So pull up a stool, Mind the swarf on the floor and let me show you the screaming machine properly, the real one, not the poster. First, let me put the machine itself in front of you because it is one of the most instantly recognizable aeroplanes ever built, and it was ugly on purpose. There is nothing sleek about a Stuka, where the fighters of the day were all smooth curves and hidden wheels. The Stuka is all angles and knuckles. Two things give it away in a heartbeat. The first is the wing. It has what we call an inverted gull wing. The wing comes out of the fuselage and kinks sharply downward, then bends back up again out towards the tip, so that from the front the two wings make a shallow letter W, or a gull with its wings held in a shrug. It looks awkward, and it looks deliberate because it was both. That bent-down shape let them fit a shorter, sturdier undercarriage leg and still keep that great propeller clear of the ground. And that brings me to the second thing, the thing you can never unsee once you've spotted it. The wheels don't go away. On almost every other frontline aeroplane of the war, the undercarriage folds up and tucks away into the wing or the belly once you're airborne, because dangling wheels drag at the air and slow you down. Not on the Stuka. Its undercarriage is fixed, bolted down, always out, always in the wind, and each leg is wrapped in a great streamlined fairing, a trouser, a spat, so the whole machine looks like it's wearing Wellington boots it never takes off. It is angular, it is fixed. It is honestly a bit sinister to look at, and every bit of that was a choice. This was not built to be pretty or to be fast. It was built to do one violent job with terrible accuracy. And I'll give the designers their due, because that fixed undercarriage, daft as it looks, was not laziness. Wheels that fold away are lovely for speed, but they are also a mass of hydraulics and gears and doors that can jam, fail, or refuse to come down when you need them. A leg that is simply bolted down and left there cannot fail to lower because it never went up. For an aeroplane meant to fly off rough frontline strips close to the fighting, tended by tired men with mud on their hands, that simplicity was a genuine virtue. It was rugged. It was easy to fix. It could take a hammering and keep flying. The Stuka was, in the ways that suited its early job, a wonderfully sturdy, honest, uncomplicated tool. Remember that because it is part of what made the disappointment when it came so complete. This was not a bad machine at what it was built for. It was a very good machine, built for a world that did not last. And that one job was diving, not gliding down and lobbing a bomb from a height and hoping. That is how most bombing was done, and it scattered bombs across the landscape like a man throwing gravel. The Stuka did something far more precise and far more frightening. It stood on its nose, dived almost vertically straight at the target, and released its bomb at the last moment, so that the bomb carried on down the exact line the aeroplane had been pointing. Aim the whole aeroplane and you aim the bomb. That is how you hit one bridge, one ship, one gun emplacement instead of a whole field around it. But a near-vertical dive is a monstrous thing to ask of a machine and a man. Dive too steep and too fast, and the aeroplane can build up so much speed it tears itself apart, or drives itself into the ground before the pilot can haul it out. So the engineers at Junkers did something genuinely clever, and I take my hat off to it as a piece of engineering even while I hold my nose at the use it was put to. They fitted dive brakes, flaps under the wings that swung out into the airflow and held the dive to a controlled, steady speed, so the aeroplane fell fast but never ran away with itself. And then, cleverer still, they built in an automatic pull-out. Here is how that worked, and it really is remarkable. As the pilot set up his dive, he'd set the machine up beforehand. When the bomb released, A mechanism automatically began to pull the aeroplane out of the dive without the pilot hauling on the stick himself. Why does that matter? Because coming out of a fast vertical dive slams enormous force onto the body, several times the weight of gravity, and that force drives the blood down out of a man's head and can black him out completely, just at the moment he most needs to be flying. The Stuka's automatic system meant that even if the pilot lost consciousness in the pull-out, the aeroplane would still recover itself and climb away. Think about that. A machine designed on the assumption that its own pilot might pass out doing the one thing it was built for, and designed to save him and itself anyway. As engineering, that is properly, coldly brilliant. And I want you to feel why all that trouble was worth it, because the accuracy it bought was, for its day, extraordinary. Think about how ordinary bombing worked. A level bomber flies along, high up, and lets its bombs go, and they fall in a long arc, thrown forward by the aeroplane's speed and pushed about by the wind. And they land, well, somewhere in the general area if you're lucky and the crew are good. To hit one small thing, a bridge, a single ship, a battery of guns, you needed a great many aeroplanes dropping a great many bombs and simply hoping the law of averages did your work for you. The Stuka changed that arithmetic. By pointing the whole aeroplane at the target and releasing low, it could put a single bomb close enough to matter with a single aeroplane. That is a colossal difference. It meant a handful of dive bombers could do what a whole formation of level bombers could not, and do it against small, hard, specific targets. That precision is the real reason the early Stuka mattered, far more than the scream, though the scream, as we'll see, is what everyone remembers. And then there is the scream. The single most famous thing about this aeroplane is a sound, and the sound was put there on purpose. On the undercarriage legs, on the trousers, out in the airflow, they fitted small sirens, wind-driven propellers on a little horn, and they had a name for them. The Jericho-Trompete, the Trumpet of Jericho, after the Bible story of the trumpets that brought the walls down. As the aeroplane dived and the air rushed faster over those little sirens, they wailed. And the faster the dive, the higher and louder the scream, until an attacking Stuka announced itself with a rising, banshee shriek that could be heard long before the bomb ever fell. Now I want to be very careful and very honest here, because this is the exact hinge of the whole story. That siren did not make the bomb 1 ounce heavier or 1 yard more accurate. It added nothing to what the aeroplane could actually do to a target. It was, purely and simply, a weapon aimed at the mind. It was there to terrify, to make the men on the ground panic and scatter and freeze, to break their nerve before the bomb even landed, to make soldiers cower in ditches and refugees run screaming off the roads. And in the early war against troops and civilians who had never met anything like it, it worked. It genuinely, horribly worked. Hold on to that, because we are going to come back to it, and it is going to turn out to matter far more than all the engineering put together. Because for a while, for a genuinely frightening while, this machine looked unstoppable. When Germany went to war in 1939, the Stuka was the flying spearhead of a new kind of warfare, the Blitzkrieg, the lightning war. The idea was speed and shock. Tanks and motorized troops punching through and overhead, the Stukas acting like flying artillery, screaming down to smash whatever stood in the way of the advance. A strong point, a bridge, a column, a gun line, with a precision no ordinary bomber could manage. That is a genuinely new idea, and it is worth pausing on. Before this, aircraft and armies fought more or less separate wars in the same place. The Stuka helped knit them together. It became, in effect, a piece of artillery that flew, one that could range far ahead of the guns, be called down onto whatever was holding up the advance, and hit it with something closer to the accuracy of a shell than the scatter of a bomb. Knock out the one bridge the enemy is retreating over. Silence the one gun battery pinning your tanks. Break up the one column massing for a counterattack. And do it now, in minutes, while it matters, not tomorrow when the moment has passed. Paired with fast-moving tanks, that was a frightening new way to make war, and for a while nobody on the other side had a ready answer to it. In Poland, in 1939, they seemed to be everywhere, tearing up roads and railways and columns ahead of the tanks. In the fall of France, in 1940, it was the same story, only worse for those on the receiving end, Stukas howling down onto the retreating armies and the crowded roads, and that scream doing at least as much damage to men's nerve as the bombs did to their bodies. And when Germany turned east and invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, at the opening of that vast campaign, the Stuka was there again, ranging ahead of the advance, and here it found perhaps its most genuinely effective role. Later in the war, on the Eastern Front, they fitted a version, the Ju-87G, the one the crews nicknamed the Kannonenvogel, the cannon bird, with a pair of big anti-tank cannons slung under the wings, and turned it into a specialized tank killer, picking off armored vehicles from low level. One pilot in particular, a man named Hans-Ulrich Rudel, became famous, and I will come back to him, and to exactly how much of his fame you should swallow, because that is a story in itself. For those 2 or 3 opening years, then, the picture the world formed was of an invincible war-winning terror weapon. The scream, the accuracy, the wreckage, the newsreels, and that picture set hard like concrete, and it is more or less the picture most people still carry around today. So let me say the myth out plainly, because it is a myth, and it is one we are all quietly prone to. The myth is this, that the Stuka was an invincible superweapon, that its terror was proof of German strength and German genius, that here was a machine so advanced, so fearsome, so perfectly deadly that it simply swept all before it, and that the fear it inspired was the honest measure of how dangerous it truly was. That the scream, in other words, was the sound of the bite. It feels obviously true. We saw it work. We saw the armies break and the roads empty and the terror on every face. Surely a thing that frightening, that dominant, that famous must have been that powerful. The fear must have been earned, mustn't it? And here is the reality, and it is very nearly the exact opposite of the myth, which is why this is one of my favorite stories to tell and one of the most uncomfortable. The Stuka was not an invincible superweapon. It was a slow, lightly built, lightly armed, thinly defended aeroplane that only ever worked because, for a while, the Germans had already won the battle in the air before the Stuka even took off. Its dominance was not a sign of German strength. It was a symptom of enemy weakness, and the moment that weakness was gone, the moment it met an air force that could actually fight back, the terror weapon turned, almost overnight, into a death trap. Turn it over with me the way I do in the workshop, because once you see it, you cannot unsee it. A Stuka was slow, a top speed of something in the region of 230 miles an hour, and much less than that loaded up with a bomb and dragging those fixed undercarriage legs and their spats through the air. A modern fighter of the day would go half as fast again. The Stuka carried only a light defensive armament, really just one man in the back with a machine gun, and it had almost no armor worth the name. And it did its killing by committing to a long, straight, predictable dive, at the bottom of which it was low, slow, and heavy, pulling out gently right in the teeth of anyone waiting for it. Every single thing that made it a superb bomber against a beaten enemy made it a sitting duck against an unbeaten one. It was only ever a terror in skies that already belonged to Germany. Take away that ownership of the air, and it was one of the most vulnerable aircraft in the war. And here is the bit people miss when they picture those early triumphs. In Poland, in France, in the first rush into the east, the Germans had already smashed or grounded much of the opposing air force before the Stukas went to work. The Stuka did its screaming, precise, terrible business in skies that were, for the most part, swept clear for it in advance by the fighters. It was the second act, not the first. The fighters won the sky. Then the Stuka strolled in and did the visible, memorable damage and took all the credit for a victory that had been half decided before it arrived. So the very campaigns that built its unbeatable reputation were exactly the campaigns where it never had to face a fair fight. The reputation and the vulnerability were not in tension at all. They were the same fact, seen from two sides. It looked invincible precisely because it was only ever sent where it could not be beaten. And we do not have to guess at this. We can point to the exact moment the truth came out, and it has a name and a date. In the summer of 1940, the Germans turned the Stuka loose over the south of England in the Battle of Britain, and for the first time, it ran headlong into a fully organized, well-led fighter force that had not been beaten first. It met the Spitfire and the Hurricane, flown by the Royal Air Force, faster, better armed and waiting. And the result was not terror. The result was a massacre of the Stukas. Slow, loaded, committed to their dives, they were shot down in such numbers so quickly that within a matter of weeks the German command pulled them out of the battle altogether. The invincible terror weapon was quietly withdrawn from the fight because it could not survive over England in daylight. That is not my opinion. That is what the Battle of Britain loss records show, and what any standard, sober aviation history of the period will tell you. Over Britain, in the face of real fighter opposition, the Stuka was a disaster, and everybody in a position to know it knew it. And I owe you a word of caution about one of the loudest sources on the other side of the ledger. That tank-busting pilot I mentioned, Hans-Ulrich Rudel, wrote a famous memoir after the war called Stuka Pilot, full of enormous claimed tallies of tanks destroyed. It is a genuine primary source, and people quote it endlessly. But I would ask you to take it with a very large pinch of salt, and I say that openly. It is a self-aggrandizing account by a man with an unrepentant politics and every reason to burnish his own legend, and historians treat its numbers with real caution. Where a source is that flattering to its author, you check it twice and you lean on it lightly. I will not pretend a single boastful memoir settles anything, and neither should you. Now let me be as square about the aeroplane as I've been about the legend, because the honest picture has a sad human weight to it. Once its vulnerability was exposed, the Stuka should really have been retired. By the middle of the war, it was plainly obsolescent, outdated, outclassed, a machine the world had moved past, and yet it went on flying in numbers right through the war, on the Eastern Front and elsewhere, long after everyone understood what a liability it was in a contested sky. Why? For the least glamorous reason in all of warfare, because Germany never managed to build a proper replacement for it, and you fight with what you have, not with what you wish you had. So crews kept climbing into an aeroplane that had been found out years before, kept diving it into skies that were no longer safe, and kept paying the price, because the machine that should have taken over from it never properly arrived. There is nothing heroic in that. It is just the grinding, wasteful truth of a war machine that outlived its moment and kept sending men down into the dive anyway. And even the scream in the end gave the game away. Those Jericho sirens I told you about, the ones that made the world afraid, a great many of them were quietly taken off later in the war. Do you know why? Because the little horns dragged in the air and cost the airplane speed, and speed was the one thing the poor, slow Stuka could least afford to lose. The terror weapon was so short of pace that it eventually gave up its own most famous feature just to claw back a few miles an hour. If you want one small detail that tells the whole story, it is that. The scream was one of the first things to go. So stand back with me now and look at the whole thing at once, because here is the inversion, plain and clear. The Stuka's fearsome reputation was real. The fear was real. The scream was real. The wreckage was real. But the reputation was not a measure of the aeroplane's power. It was a measure of its enemy's weakness. It shone brightest exactly where the opposition was poorest, and it went dark the instant it met anyone who could shoot back properly. The scream that terrified the world added nothing to the bomb. It was theater, brilliant, cynical theater, aimed at the nerves and not the target. And the machine underneath the legend was not a super weapon at all but a specialized, fragile tool that had been mistaken by its enemies, by the newsreels, and by history ever since, for something far mightier than it ever was. It was never invincible. It was only ever unopposed. And here is where I turn it round on you, because I did not spend all this time on one ugly old dive bomber just to correct the history books. There is something the Stuka taught me out in the workshop that I chew on more than I probably ought to. It's this: a fearsome reputation can outlive by years and years the reality that ever earned it. We hear the scream and we assume the bite. We see the fear on people's faces, and we take that fear as proof of real, present strength, when very often the fear is a leftover, an echo, a thing that made sense once, in conditions that have long since changed and simply never got corrected. The Stuka went on being frightening in the popular imagination for years after it had stopped being genuinely dangerous in a fair fight. The legend ran on long after the engine behind it had failed. And people do this. Reputations do this. The fearsome boss everyone still tiptoes around, whose real power left the building 2 promotions ago. The intimidating rival whose dominance depended entirely on a soft market that has quietly hardened. The dreaded competitor, the scary institution, the unbeatable-seeming thing whose whole terror rests, if you actually go and look, on nobody yet having stood up to it properly. We keep flinching at the scream long after the thing that could bite has slowed down and gone lame. So here is the question I actually want to leave you with, and it is a real one. Where in your own life is there a Stuka? A reputation you are still afraid of, a scream you still flinch at, that might turn out if you finally sent up a Spitfire to meet it in a fair fight, to be slow and lightly armed, and only ever dangerous because nobody had yet been willing to face it. Because I promise you they are everywhere, once you know to listen for the difference between the scream and the bite. And I promise you that the next time something loud and famous and frightening comes howling down out of the sky at you, you'll find yourself wondering, quietly, whether the thing behind the noise can actually fight, or whether it has only ever been allowed to win. So that's my question for you, and I do read the comments, so tell me straight. First one. Before today, did you think of the Stuka as a war-winning superweapon, the invincible terror of the Blitzkrieg, or did you already know that it was pulled out of the Battle of Britain in weeks because the Spitfires and Hurricanes were cutting it to ribbons? Be honest. Most people only ever heard the scream and never the second half of the story. And then the bigger one, the one I actually care about. Where's the Stuka in your own life? The fearsome reputation you finally faced down and found was slow and lightly armed all along, dangerous only until somebody dared to meet it. Put it down below. I read them all, and the good ones make my week. I'm off to lose an argument with Stan, who insists the Stuka was the deadliest aeroplane of the whole war, and refuses to hear a word against it. This, from a man who was so intimidated by his own new lawnmower that he left it in the shed for a year before he dared start it. And then it turned out the petrol was off. And don't get me started on old Bessie, who still won't start on a cold morning no matter what I bolt to her, screaming siren or no. My granddad, who saw a few things he never much liked to talk about, told me once that the loudest thing in the room is hardly ever the most dangerous, and that you want to watch the quiet ones. He was right. He usually was. So if you liked having the legend taken apart and the real machine put back in front of you, warts, scream, death dive, and all, then subscribe and stick around, because I've a whole workshop full of misunderstood old war machines to walk you through. The crude one that won, the beautiful one that failed, and like today, the terrifying one that turned out to be far weaker than the fear it sold. The name's Reg. Mind your head on the way out of the hangar, and the next time somebody tells you the Stuka was invincible, you nod, and you buy them a drink, and you tell them what happened the summer it finally met the Spitfire.